Buddy, I think most of the people are in here, and we just have a few stragglers that are downstairs who I'm sure will show up at some point and grace us with their presence. Did everybody get breakfast of some sort? Okay. And one of those glasses that looks white is not milk, it's some sort of smoothie, so that could be disorienting if you're really tired. It was delicious, still delicious. Welcome to PuppetCamp Europe. So I'm glad everybody could make it to Amsterdam. How many of you, for how many of you is this the first Puppet conference you've been to? Holy shit, okay. That's good, new blood, new blood. How many of you were at the one in San Francisco last? A few people, okay. Well, for the people that were at both, this is the European crowd, so we have to behave ourselves and can't act, we can't act totally American. I tried to dress more nicely. I'm wearing a sweater, wearing pants. I wonder about this because, I'm Deepak, by the way. Hello. If you've seen videos of the other Puppet camps, I've been the MC for the last couple, so if you liked that, then great, and you're my friend, and if you didn't, then you're kind of screwed, because I hopefully won't do too much talking. But it's one of those things where in the States when we have them, and we have people that come and talk, and they have English accents or European accents, I kind of naturally assume that everything they say is smarter and makes sense because, they have the accent. So it's Harry Potter, and I love you, man. So here, I assume it's not the same thing. I assume you hear someone with an American accent talking, and you just assume that they're idiots. Well, Luke has an American accent, so, he'll clean it up for everybody, pretty much. So we have wireless information. But not wireless, so best of luck. Venture forth, ye intrepid digital explorers, and let me know how that works out for you. You may or may not get an IP address, but you guys are hardcore, so you could do something. You've seen Hackers or Swordfish like 27 times, so you should probably be able to do something with that. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you, except now maybe, you can use this opportunity to think about if disaster happened and you did not have internet access, how would your life change? And you can close your laptop, and honestly, we should take a pool to see how long it's going to take before someone flips out and then just starts crying, or because they can't get push notifications for their Twitter app on their phone or something like that. I'm screwed. So the agenda here is not going to be super complicated. Most of the talks are going to be in here. I'll try and direct everybody to where there's going to be other things going on. There's going to be a partner session at 10, and it's going to be in that room right over there. And there's essentially like a couple of rooms to choose from, and someone helpfully pointed out how to pronounce it the Dutch way. So I'm gonna mess that up. But there's Rode Kamer, which is red room, and Blauw Kamer, which is blue room. Is that okay? All right. My last name is 14 letters long, so I get some street cred in terms of not being able to pronounce things correctly. I've earned a lot of it. So before we get started really quick, there's, this year was it's kind of washed out, actually. I'm not really sure if there's a way to like turn off one of those lights or anything like that. But anyway, there are a couple of sponsors that graciously helped make this thing possible, and this year was a banner year. We had a lot of them. But I'll be mentioning them sort of as we go through, and a lot of people that are on the sponsorship list are going to be giving talks. But in particular, there are a number of local companies, so that get to know them, because I'm sure they need people, and all of you guys seem pretty smart and very good looking. So beyond that, I'm not going to waste a whole lot more time because we're already past 9. So the first speaker, hopefully everybody should know. If you've ever been yelled at on the mailing list, it was probably Luke that did it. The chief. We have a James for that now. We have a James. That's true. James does all the yelling at this point. The chief executive officer, which I don't know. It's a little weird saying that, but it's true. So I need to get used to it. All right, everybody. This is Luke.
All right.
Luke, I'm going to take 2 minutes of your time.
That looks like a lot of
Like
Belgian beer.
Thanks for Puppet, and well, too bad you didn't do in Belgium, but at least you got Belgian beer Puppets now.
Thank you very much. I'll have to drink all this before I leave, so. So my talk isn't quite so single-threaded in topic as the title would suggest, but I had to put something up there. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. But obviously, first, I do usually like to have questions during the talk. It helps me, for one, prove that at least one of you is paying attention. And two, it just, I'm going to say a bunch of things here, some of which are theories, some of which are definitely true, and some of which are probably complete BS, and it's nice to be called on it when necessary. So I figured I'd give you a quick update on the company because it's a little bit weird being a person running a company around a product that I started a long time ago. And for most of the time, I guess now, so I've been doing this for 6 years. I started the company and the project in February of 2005. So it's right about 6 years. And for about half of that, it was completely me by myself, not literally in my basement because that had dirt walls, but it kind of felt like it was in my basement by myself. And then the other half was with a couple of people, and then since we got investment, it's been growing very quickly. So there's kind of these phases, and I have no idea what it looks like from the community's perspective, whether any of you were even around back then, and if so, whether it feels like we're either more awesome and active and doing more or are less participatory or whatever. So I'm just going to try to give you an idea of what our world looks like. So first, we have 40 people now. And that's a lot of people to try to figure out how to manage. This is my first job ever as a manager, so if I ever seem stressed out, it's because I'm trying to figure out how the heck to do my job. We have, it's worth noting, we have really, really awesome investors and board members, and this is really important because I'm still actually the CEO, and this matters because we do things periodically where I hear people say, oh, your investors must be forcing you to blah, 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 and that's not actually what happens. We make mistakes a lot as companies, but we're the ones who are making the mistakes. It's not our investors who are coming to us and saying, hey, you have to switch from this license to that license, or you have to commercialize things, or you have to do these things. There might be mistakes in the end. Obviously, I hope not. But if they're mistakes that we're choosing to make. We're not being forced to do any of this by our investors. So we're trying to, the point behind the company is to essentially be able to employ enough developers that we can actually do the things we want to do with product. We want to build certain kinds of product. We want to change the industry in certain ways, and we can't do that without a lot of people. So a big part of what we're trying to do is get to the point where we have enough people to build the products we want to build. And a lot of that is community, but a lot of that is actually having full-time development. So if it looks like sometimes we're doing crazy things because our investors are trying to force us to earn a lot of money, it's actually because we want to earn a lot of money to build better products. So Apache, or Puppet 2.7 is going to be released very soon. We're in RC state right now. We're obviously hoping to have it out by PuppetCamp, and that didn't quite happen. But I think RC2 will be put out today. So I want to go through some of the things that are happening in Puppet. First is that we have changed the license to Apache. And there were a number of things driving this, but in the end, the biggest thing was we wanted more people to be able to use Puppet. We want it everywhere, right? We want absolutely everyone to be using Puppet and have it as many places as possible. And we talked to a number of companies who were hesitant to include Puppet on their distributions or include Puppet on their devices or to integrate with Puppet because the GPL scared them either for stupid reasons, like they shouldn't have actually been afraid, they were just being unnecessarily afraid, or for relatively valid reasons, like Cisco made some mistakes in terms of open source and got thrashed very heavily, and so now they're very afraid of certain kinds of open source. So it's basically about reducing the number of barriers to people using and integrating with Puppet to as few as possible was the primary goal there. So far, I've been actually really surprised how little pushback we've gotten. So far, I've gotten one single person complaining about this license change. My guess is almost no one knows or cares about the real differences. So it's been really great. So the second thing is Faces is kind of the major feature in the release, but I'm going to talk about that like the second half of the talk, so I'm not really going to talk about that here. Then there are a couple of smaller things that are kind of pointing towards what else we'll be doing or are kind of interesting on their own. There's a plugin in 2.7 called a static compiler where you can essentially switch how your compiling is done to use this. And what this does is essentially largely eliminates all file serving on your clients. So your client gets, instead of getting a catalog that has a file URL in it, it gets a catalog that has all the file information in it. And so your clients no longer really talk to your server about any kind of files at all. This is recursive or non-recursive, and it should make client-server communication dramatically simpler, cheaper, faster, better looking. I would love to give you numbers associated with this, but the people who I've given to test this to didn't. So, but you can do some simple math, and it's pretty clear that it makes a pretty big difference. The reason it's not enabled by default, it will be in the next release, but the reason it's not enabled by default is it has some architectural complexities associated with it. I'm trying to think, I guess it was on a ticket that we'll be posting about this soon, providing more documentation on how to use it once the release actually comes out. But this is an example of us trying to take the system itself, taking the overall core, make it simpler, smaller, faster, and just overall easier to do math on. When you had a catalog that had file URLs in it, there were a lot of things you couldn't depend on because of those file URLs. There were, maybe your catalog might not change, but the remote files would change, and so you have the chance to have some strange discrepancies that now kind of go away. We also finally have an API that you can use for remote signing of certificates. So if you've got your Puppet server over here and you're doing all your work from your development or your admin workstation, you can do things like sign certificates from the command line over REST API or whatever using that. And this is kind of a small and yet big thing. We've found a way to build what I would say is a non-hackable deterministic ordering for resources that don't have relationships. So if you've got relationships in Puppet between resources, you have guaranteed ordering there. But for resources that don't have a relationship, if you've got 3 resources mentioned in a class, but no relationships between them, which would be weird, Puppet, it's like programming where you've got a hash. Usually the hash keys come out in an arbitrary order. That's pretty much the exact way that Puppet was using to pick which order to do resources in. So what we're actually doing now is we're sorting resources by the hash of the title. So you can't hack it because you can't choose a title that will determine a hash that will result in the sorting that you want. So you can't essentially not use relationships because this ordering is available. But what it will give you is at least consistent ordering. It'll be arbitrary, but any 2 resources in your system that don't otherwise have relationships will always run in the same order now. The fact that it's so difficult to talk about is an indication of how kind of esoteric it feels, but for some people at least this will make life a little bit simpler. And this is one of those internal features that again points to where we're going and what kinds of things you should be seeing in the next 6 months that is entirely boring right now, but hopefully will be cool at some point. So we've changed how graphing works internally that's going to allow us to do a couple of cool things. One of them, we've implemented a thing called in the mathematical world called graph frontiers, and one of the things it's going to allow us to do is actually combine package commands in the near future. So we can say things like if you're doing yum installs, right now it takes roughly a year to do any sort of packaging with yum, but we can reduce that down to like 2 weeks if we can combine all of those yum commands into as few calls to yum as possible. So we don't quite have that as part of this release, but we've got some infrastructure in place that's going to make a lot of those things easier. And you're going to see other interesting things like cross-node dependencies. There are a lot of different things that this enables. So I know this is internals related, but we're trying to find the interesting mathematical aspects of Puppet internals. We're doing a better job of getting those enabled. So I figured to talk a little bit about Puppet Enterprise 2 because I know it comes up. The first thing that I want to be very loud and clear on is that it's always based on full open source releases. This isn't a case where we're taking open source versions of products and then modifying them in some way and having a commercial version of Puppet and an open source version of Puppet. It is, right now I think it's 2.6.4. It is always and forever going to be a completely open and released version of all the products that are in it. So we're not doing any kind of weird hackery there. And we're always looking for partners to help us sell and distribute the product. We do have professional services, but we don't have a lot of it. And so we're looking for people to help us do that side, and we can focus on the product. We'll be putting out another update release next month, focusing mostly on additional platform support. And this is kind of weird because Puppet already runs great on these platforms, but there's a difference between Puppet running great and us saying, yes, we've tested all the combinations, and actually we think Puppet Enterprise and the whole thing actually runs really well. And then next month in June, we'll be integrating Puppet with some provisioning tools. So you have, as part of that distribution, you have both bare metal provisioning with tools like Cobbler, and then also cloud-based provisioning. We've got a module coming out in the next couple of weeks that does integration with Puppet and EC2. So it's very easy to get Puppet instances up and running in various things. It's just integrated with Fog. So we don't do the work, but you can take Puppet, make it work in various cloud platforms. And we'll also have some basic discovery tools that allow you to, given a network of lots of machines, when you're going to add those to Puppet, it makes it very easy to find those machines, get them added to your Puppet infrastructure. And then in Q3, we'll be looking at, the Puppet framework runs on Windows, but it doesn't actually do very much on Windows. We'll be looking at getting all of Puppet running on Windows, and then again, getting the whole enterprise platform supported on Windows. And assuming that we can get 2.7 stable enough, fast enough, our goal is by about this time to get PE based on 2.7, because there really is a ton of infrastructure in 2.7 that's going to enable us to make everything a lot better. And our goal here, one of the things, and this isn't necessarily related to Puppet Enterprise, but one of our goals is to get the Puppet core as small and simple as possible. So we want to do things like move the Nagios plugins out of Puppet, because people who aren't using Nagios shouldn't be needing to do that, and make it so that our module management tools are as good as possible, so that when there are modules online, you can use those modules very, very easily, and they don't have to ship with the core platform. So we want to make the core platform itself very small, very stable, as fast as possible, and then rely on external tools as much as possible from there. So I'm here to really talk about making Puppet a bit more hackable. And part of this story, part of what led me to this, is actually marketing. So when I was just comparing Puppet to CF Engine, or I was just comparing Puppet to the shell scripts that people were writing on their own, it was relatively easy to say, look, it's freaking easy, you can read it, it's understandable. The story didn't need to be very good because the competitive stories weren't very good. But now we're 6 years down the road, and it's become a lot harder to talk about how Puppet is different, and kind of more importantly, why Puppet is different. One of the things we find when we train people in Puppet is that the hardest part is not actually the technical bits. It's not getting people to understand how to use Puppet. It's getting people to go through a kind of mental shift that they understand to think about the world in terms of resources. They have to go from commands and processes and shell scripts to these resource entities. And then there are all these other pieces that go into Puppet's internals that they have to begin to understand. And sometimes it can begin to feel a little bit awkward. And the awkwardness is there for a reason. It's not accidental. It's not like we kind of, oops, we made a weird platform. A lot of it is actually intentional, not that we wanted it to be awkward, but that this transition itself is awkward because it's a different way of thinking about the world. So we were trying to find a better way of describing why Puppet was this way. It's not enough to say it is this way. You have to have some story of why it's this way, so people go, okay, I'm inspired enough by that why that I can push through the awkwardness, I can push through the complexity, and get to the real value of the system. So I want to talk a little bit about what led me to want the things that are awkward about Puppet. When I was using CF Engine, there were a bunch of things that stuck out, and some of this is based off of a talk that I gave at Pivotal Labs in February, I think, and it's all that talk is online, and that talk is very heavily focused on the modeling aspects of Puppet. But first, you were stuck with how CF Engine thought about the world. It has a certain application logic. It has a certain way of thinking about the world, and you're stuck with that. You couldn't recombine the capabilities it had into other things, and you couldn't swap core components out. You couldn't say, oh, well, I don't like the way you do your database work. I don't like the way you do your networking. I don't like the way you do your anything. You were stuck with all of it. It was one complete consolidated platform, and as long as everything that it did were things that you liked, then brilliant. But if there were things that you weren't so happy with, then it started to get complicated. And there were a lot of questions that I had given CF Engine information about, things that I had explained to CF Engine that it couldn't then store for me and tell either me when I was 2 months later when I had forgotten what I had done, or my coworkers or things like that, right? So there's all this information, this context, this intent that I had provided that I couldn't extract back out of the system. And then there was a lot of stuff that I felt like should have been mathematically calculable, like whether classes conflict or not, that I couldn't ask CF Engine. It couldn't ask of its own things. So it was this kind of opaque ball of twine that I couldn't get into. I couldn't manipulate it or ask interesting questions of. And then finally, it wasn't extensible. So if you found that it does almost what you wanted, but you wanted to add some additional functionality, it was very difficult to do this. And it was a little bit infuriating, because you could tell that internally, it was relatively extensible. It was possible to think about the world like this, but the models themselves were coherent and relatively consistent, but you couldn't add new models. So when we went to build Puppet, these are some of the things that I really focus on. This is what led to us talking about. Obviously, first, it is fantastically extensible. And this extensibility puts a lot of constraints on you, because it says things like, well, if you want to be extensible, you can't you can't use internal APIs, right? You have to, if you look at the resource types that are in Puppet, they don't use APIs that you don't get to use. Obviously, it's open source, so you can do whatever the heck you want, right? But I can't exactly conceal things from you in that case. But they're not even trying to use secret APIs. They're not saying, oh, well, here's stuff that ships at the core, and then here are the plugins. The plugins are the things that ship at the core. And that kind of extensibility meant that we had to really encapsulate everything. We had to make sure that when you talk about resource types, or when you talk about providers, or when you talk about features, or anything like that, they're all built to be, to have a level of queryability, to have an amount of encapsulation that other tools, certainly at the time, but even today, don't have. There are 10 different kinds of plugins in Puppet. And I don't mean 10 plugins, but there's providers, types, features, facts. There are all these different places where you can extend Puppet. And it's getting to the point where I think the next release we're going to actually ship with plugin management in the system, because there's so many different ways you can plug into Puppet that we need some actually higher level tools to help you manage all the plugins that you might have. And in our Puppet world, we found that it actually became more beneficial to focus on the artifacts, on kind of the nouns that you were building, than on the verbs you were using to build those. So we end up talking a lot more about facts and catalogs and events and resources and reports than we do about code. Because the code is like this teeny little state. It's this teeny little stage of Puppet's existence. But as soon as we get out of the code, then that's where the actual magic happens, right? Nothing actually happens in the code. We can't directly apply manifest. We go through this stage of, well, first we convert a manifest into catalog, and then interesting stuff actually happens. But even in our code, and hopefully I'll remember to demo this for you guys, but even in our code, you can actually ask interesting questions of our code. You can now, in 2.7, you can ask Puppet what classes exist, what parameters do these classes require, what nodes exist. There are all these questions you can ask, what's the base class for that class? So you can get lists of all the classes that are out there. You can get a lot of other information from these classes. So all these questions that you can ask of our system that you can't really ask of any other systems. And the problem is that a lot of these questions are, we'll get to the problems later, but these questions are all things that you can ask. And when I say you, mostly what I mean is me, actually, because a lot of these questions aren't necessarily tools that answer these for you right now. There's no, Puppet file audit tool, or no Puppet, what happens if I restart this service. There's no simple way to say, given a service or given a resource, give me the subgraph for that resource. What are the downstream effects of changes in this world? All this information is available, and I knew this, but there aren't really simple tools to give you all this information. So this is what led us to start talking about faces. But one of the big things that became obvious in the last couple of years is that the data ends up being far more important and far more valuable than code. Being able to cache code is not that valuable. Being able to cache data, being able to pass data around, being able to port data, being able to send data to another application. We've got people who are integrating Puppet with commercial applications, or with reporting tools or CMDBs, things like that. They can just take our data and do interesting things with it. If we sent them our code, that would not be useful or helpful. But sending them our data, suddenly, that's really helpful. And the graph really does matter in this case. There's a huge amount of information that's available in this graph. And I think most people who use Puppet are vaguely aware of the graph. And they do things like, they run into a dependency cycle periodically, and they convert the graph to a PNG, and they look at that and see, okay, there's my cycle. But I don't think we get nearly as much value from the graph as we should be able to get. So I want to talk briefly about this. I think to this day, and you can look at commercial tools, you can look at open source tools, you can look at mythical tools that don't exist yet. I think we're still the only tool out there that we know every single host you're managing, along with all the things that are relevant to manage that host, all the data you need to make that host configured correctly. We know every resource you're managing, every dependency between those resources, and we know every single change that's ever happened on your infrastructure. We don't necessarily store all this data for you automatically, but we know all of those things about your infrastructure. There's pretty much nothing about anything that happens anywhere in your system that happens through Puppet that we can't tell you at some point. So one of our goals in the Puppet platform in the next couple of years is to do a better job of extracting that value. But the data is all there right now. If you wanted to take Puppet today and begin injecting those things into Splunk, or into, if you've got your own complicated semantic modeling tools, you can put the data from Puppet into those systems right now and begin doing interesting math on it. I don't think anybody else has all those things. And then, of course, to go with it, we have simulation and discovery and inspection and things like that. So this is really the core of when I think of the models at the core of Puppet. those models result in this fact, that everything comes down to data. Everything goes through this data step. And when you start talking about these things and you compare us to, especially the open source tools around it, it becomes interesting because it ends up looking a lot like Chef is basically CF Engine rewritten in Ruby. They took the most important things that we added to CF Engine and removed them when they decided to write Chef. The things they hated the most about Puppet were the most critical additional features that we added compared to CF Engine. So it's a little bit weird, and some of the things that matter the most to me, completely missing there. So, all right. So we've talked about some of these differences, and we've talked about some of the kind of high-level features, but given how everybody's turbo yawning, it's clear that this way of talking about it doesn't really work that well, right? It's not very compelling. It's not something you can go and tell your friends and bosses and coworkers, no, Puppet is awesome because 18-minute lecture on data. That's not very helpful, right? So you want to come up with some sort of snappy marketing phrase that you can give to people and say, well, Puppet is awesome because blah, 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 and they go, I don't know what that means, but I'm totally going to repeat it like I do. So we started using the phrase model-driven. We started saying, oh, well, Puppet is model-driven. And this worked really well for about 3 months. Then somebody said, well, what does that mean? And we were like, well, it's the, crap. And I had this story for a while that, well, we started in this procedural world where we really focused on the verbs, and the nouns were kind of incidental. They weren't really important to us. They were there, but they weren't really important. And then at some point we switched to saying, now that we're focusing on the nouns, we're model-driven. That's what it means. But again, even if you go to people and you say, Puppet is a tool that focuses on the nouns, they're going to go, yeah, that's not very interesting. And this is helpful because you can take all these nouns and inject things into them and send them other places and things like that. So that's relatively interesting, but it doesn't really help that much because no one actually knows what that means. The critical part of and I know in the technical world, marketing has a negative connotation. But to me, marketing is the ability to come up with a way of talking about your stuff that other people can repeat, and pass on information, right? It's very important. When I'm out on the internet helping people use Puppet, that's marketing. Like marketing it doesn't have to be a dirty word. Advertising, mostly a dirty word. Marketing doesn't have to be a dirty word. A huge amount of activities that we think of as beneficial and helpful and useful fall under marketing. If it sounds like I'm being whatever, sellout-like when I talk about marketing, I'm trying to use it in the more technical sense. But you need to be able to talk about what it means, talk about these features in a way that people get and find compelling. And I was working with Nick Fagerland, who's our tech writer, and trying to describe the benefits of model-driven. And I was doing this stuttering thing that I have been doing so often the last 6 months. Well, it's just really awesome. And then the data, and he looks at me and goes, it sounds like what you're trying to say is that Puppet is more hackable because it's model-driven. And I went, no, that's not it at all. And then 30 minutes later, I went, no, that's actually totally it. So, and it's interesting because I keep trying to get the people we work with in PR to let me put out press releases that include the word hackable. And they say, no, everyone, if you say hackable, what everyone who reads that is going to think is, it just means it's easier to break into Puppet. But I think most people in this room, when you see hackable, you know that it means not that, but that instead you can do what you want to do with the system. You don't have to ask Puppet's permission to do stupid things to it. But as I began thinking about this, what I realized was that it's not really true. You can program Puppet, and when I say you, mostly I mean me. There's an unfortunate amount of Puppet today that still, I'm the only person who knows the dark, dirty secrets of how to combine internals of Puppet. And now we have more of those people, but still the average Puppet user isn't going to know, oh, wow, I can take these internal subsystems and look, it caught on fire. That ability needs to exist and needs to be available to everybody, not just to the core experts, the 4 or 5 people who are dabbling in the graph all the time, or the 2 or 3 people in their DSL, right? It needs to be everywhere. I want to see everyone with scorch marks on their hands next year. So really, it's not about hackability or modularity right now. We've got a very well encapsulated system. There are a lot of different parts of Puppet that are very tightly encapsulated. They're not kind of spread across the world. It's very modular. I can point to different parts of Puppet that are, again, not just plugins, but like the compiling system or things like that. And it's very data-driven. We do have a lot of data. We think heavily about data. But that is, can I just say, not a very good marketing story. None of those terms are very interesting and useful, but certainly as a complete story, it's not very good. But unfortunately, we've fallen into the same trap that CF Engine had. We have all these internals that would enable us to not fall into that trap, but we still have these core few applications that all of our application logic is encoded into. And if you would like to do other silly things, you can't really do that. So this is our agent logic right now. If you run a Puppet agent, these 5 steps are done every time. And if you'd like to skip one of those steps, have fun. If you'd like to do one of those steps more often than other steps, have fun. There are a lot of other things that people ask me for that I can ship them an application that does that, but Puppet doesn't make it easy to build your own applications that do that. I've got a customer who wants to have Puppet check in every 60 seconds, and if there's no change in the catalog, do nothing at all. But if there is a change, they want every host in their network to update within 60 seconds. I've got customers who only want to update, they want to update the fax all the time. They want to send that in all the time, but they only want to update the catalog once a week during a maintenance window. There are a lot of different things that people would like to be able to do by mucking around with what feels like internals right now, but is actually really annoyingly difficult to do right now. And it doesn't make sense to go in and add this functionality to Puppet applications. Can you imagine a Puppet agent flag that was something like run every 60 seconds and only do anything if there's a change? Like, dash dash that with underscores, I guess. That doesn't make any sense, right? So you want to say, okay, well, let's extract our logic and put it in a place. And if we go back to this, right, can you find the part of Puppet right now that makes that logic visible? Can you find the part of Puppet and go, there are the 5 steps that is our application logic? No, because we haven't been forced to say, let's bring this up into a way that the application logic itself is very visible. So if you wanted to build your own application, you could start by duplicating that logic and then adding some conditionals and times and random sleeps and things like that. It's not really visible because we haven't been thinking about the world like that before. So so doing it yourself is pretty difficult with the existing tools. You end up doing a lot of programming. So what I said was, it's true that I'm right almost all the time, but I'm not right all the time. So what we should do is expose everything we have and let you experiment. We don't know what you're going to do with it. No idea. I don't want to know. In many ways, no, literally, I really don't want to know. So expose that to you, let you build what you want, and then some of those things will make it into the core because they'll be absolutely awesome, and some of those things will never hear from you again because your computer will explode. So all these pieces, these things that you hear us talk about, but you kind of go, well, I never interact with that part of the system because all I do is I use Puppet, or I use Puppet Agent, or I use the Puppet Master. I don't interact directly with the transactional system. I don't interact with the compiler. I mean, yeah, I write code and then stuff happens, but I don't talk to the compiler directly. So all these parts of the system, these functional aspects that you don't really interact with directly. And then there's all this data that it exists, and you can kind of go, I can find the YAML cache for the catalog, or I can find where the reports are stored in the server, but that's not really the same thing as having real access to that system. And in a lot of cases, there's an awkwardness around when you do need to interact with those, that you always feel like there's more I'd like to do here, but I can't because it's a little bit difficult. So many of you probably saw me begin to experiment with what I was calling interfaces about 3 months ago. And this is basically trying to build as thin a skin as possible in all these pieces, all these parts of the system. And that experimentation led to, it ended up being really interesting. A lot of people in PS started doing a lot of interesting things with this. And I think a few other people, Richard Crowley, I think is here, was doing some interesting work with it. So we had a lot of interesting experimentation, and it actually went really, really well. It ended up being a very small amount of work that resulted in a lot of functionality. And this is what we ended up turning into faces. And we called it faces because, on the one hand, we don't want to call it. One of the mistakes I've made too much in Puppet is by using generic terms that already have a bunch of meanings that everyone agrees on, and using those terms to mean something completely, or not completely different, but relatively different in Puppet. So we wanted to not use the word interface because that's too generic of a term. But if you accidentally interchange face and interface, no one's going to think you're a moron. We experimented with things like strings and other terms to call it, but it seemed like a good middle ground. And faces is really two things. First and foremost, it's a framework for taking all the parts of Puppet that are there and exposing them directly to you via both a very simple API and a CLI. And it's not just exposing it to you, but it's very easy to extend this. And in fact, I'm gonna do something stupid and do a kind of a live demo of running through some of the things you can do with faces, and then also hopefully doing some extensions of some of the functionality that's there right now. So you'll see, no, really, it actually is quite easy. So getting access to all these pieces and then extending and interacting, composing, and things like that. And then it's also, there's a collection of these faces that ship with Puppet in 2.7, and there are something like 14 of these. So there are 14 new applications that ship in Puppet. And if that seems like a lot, remember that when Git first came out, it had something like 164 applications. So we've still got a little ways to go. But there are a bunch of these out of the gate, and you'll begin to see a lot more once people realize how ridiculously easy it is to add them. So one of the really awesome things about this is it directly exposes all these internals in Puppet, all these parts of Puppet that you didn't know existed, or maybe you knew existed, but you didn't know how to interact with, and you didn't know what kind of stupid things were being done. The bad thing is it exposes all these internals in a way that probably you didn't actually want to know about. All right, so let's see if we can do some examples. And this is going to take me a little bit of hackery to get to the point where I can do this, because I have to switch my display to mirroring, because I don't want to... let's see. Can't see that at all, can you? Oh, look, there it is. Is that reasonable? All right, well, all right, so if we look at the demos we had, one of the things you can do is, let's see if this works. So I told you there were a lot of example faces. So you'll recognize some of these things are things like entities that already exist in Puppet. We already know we've got reports, we've got SSL keys, we've got files, certificate revocation lists. All of our nouns are all visible. And we've also got some other things. Is this big enough? I can make it a little bit bigger if it's not big enough for people. In the back? All right. All right. So all the nouns you know and care about or hate or whatever, and then some of the subsystems like the parser, the configuration. I think there are some more, but and then some things that you're like, well, why is that there? Like the secret agent thing is a little bit silly, but it's basically it's our first attempt. We weren't able to replace the existing agent with a new application that exposes that logic, like I was talking about. But this is what it should look like. It's like 95% there. I don't think we're going to quite get it finished in 2.7. So we're going to walk through some of these, and like I said, I think by the time the next release ships, this will probably be doubled in number because there are going to be so many useful things that you all begin writing that we didn't think would be that we didn't think to do on our own. So as an example, don't know what that was, but so this is us compiling a catalog and printing it as JSON on the console. And that doesn't seem that interesting. But today, if you want to look at a catalog, the only way to get a catalog right now is to actually use an agent to compile a catalog and have it cached locally and then look at that cached catalog, right? So if you want to say, I want to look in the guts, there's something in there, you have to have an agent. You have to have the agent talk to the server. You have to take that, save it to disk, and then go look at the disk, right? But with this right now, any host in your network, I don't care who it is, if you've got a cached node for that host and you've got cached facts, you're on your server or whatever, and you're wondering, what the heck is going on with that thing? You can take that node and look at the catalog right now. So I rendered this to JSON, but let's say you're interested in looking at the graph. You can render it as DOT, and see if this works. I don't really know. I don't have a network, and that's why it's complaining at me, I think. See if this opens the right thing. I didn't demo this part when I was testing this on my own, but so again, you're curious about a host. You forgot to run that host in graph mode. You've run into some sort of problem. You're wondering, what the heck is going on? Now you can easily render any host into DOT format at the drop of a hat whenever the heck you feel like it. Oh, but let's say you've got 1,000 of these, and you're wondering, or you would like to compare two hosts, or you'd like to compare the old catalog to the new catalog. This is all now pretty easy. You can say, render this from the development environment, render it in the production environment, and then look at them both in graphical form and bounce the monitor up and down. And again, this is all very directly exposed to you. You don't have to go through our application logic and our, puppet-d -- graph and then SCP, the who's it, what's it to my, that's all unnecessary now. Nice. Of course, this is the time where the network would begin working and people are going to begin tweeting to me. So let's see if this all works now. All right. So other demos. So I have here a server running. One of the things that people have a lot of interest in is separating the running of Puppet from the downloading the catalog or the uploading the facts or things like that. I just want to run. I don't want to necessarily do any of their pieces. I know multiple people who are using curl, for instance, to pull the catalog down from the server so they have complete control over when any of the updates happen. So this is an example of us saying, look, you can just upload the facts, hopefully it works, whenever you want, right? Whenever you feel like it. And this will default to using the cert name. I think it might not work if I change. Yeah, so that fails because it doesn't have access to upload facts for other people. But you can change the cert name. So if you've got things like, oh, well, my name is foobar, it uses the existing application logic of cert name being meaningful. But once you've got that cert name set to whatever you want it to be set to, obviously it defaults to the host name, but if you're using UUIDs or whatever you want, all that will work. And then you can say things like, here's an interesting one. Refreshing your plugins, which probably won't do anything, but if we say, so we've got a plugin that will just download a command that will just download your plugins for you. So how many people, when they're trying to figure out plugin sync and they're trying to understand exactly what is being downloaded and how that whole system is working, you go through this confusing area. And then you can do the downloading of your catalog. It'll save that to the same place your catalog is normally saved. And then apply that catalog, and it's printing out the report that resulted. It's supposed to actually print a summary. I thought that was supposed to be. Anyway, so you can see that those are the 5 steps, and the printing of the running of catalog and sending report was combined into one step in there. But that's the application logic that is the heart of the Puppet agent, exposed individually as separate commands. So now if you want to build your own app that says, oh, well, I want to upload facts every 10 minutes, and I want to download the catalog only once a week, but I want to actually run the catalog every hour, you can do all that. And you could probably pretty easily write a shell script that was 10 lines long that did all that for you, right? Or a cron job that had each of those entries in it by itself. So that's a pretty simple example of the kind of things that you can now do with Puppet Faces that would have been annoyingly difficult to do on your own. You could have done all that before, but the applications you would have been writing to do that would have been 150 lines long. You'd have had to handle option handling on the CLI. Notice that all these options that I'm doing, the render as and the like the -- cert name, those things are all just wired into the system. It's just directly wired in. You don't have to think about it at all. If there's a default argument that works on any of the other Puppet commands, they all work on these. There are a couple of standard arguments that work with all faces, like the rendering arguments, and with most of the faces, you can specify terminuses and things like that. So there's a lot of capability in the system that I don't have any idea what you're going to do with, but I have some confidence that at least some of them will be relatively awesome. All right, so let's talk about some extensibility. So I think I'm pretty low on time, so rather than writing them, I'm going to cheat and just look at some of the ones that I already have. So, all right. So here's an example of a custom action. So there's this separation between faces and actions. So faces is the high-level thing. Catalog, config, plugin. Actions are the various verbs that are available. You can think of faces as the nouns and the actions as the verbs. So it's ridiculously simple to add actions onto existing faces, and it's also very simple to add new faces. So this is an example where 2.7 will ship with a print action on config. So you can say puppet config print foobar, and it'll give you the value of that config. So you guys probably know about the print config option, or is it the config print option, or is it and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So that option was hung off of some of the Puppet commands, but not all of them. So you had to remember whether it was Puppet agent that knew how to config print, or whether it was Puppet master. It was very confusing. So now you don't have to worry about that. There's a separate config option, config face, that will give you this. So what config print will give you is you can say, and it'll tell you the value. And I wrote this really simple action, and I wanted to know what the documentation for that was, rather than knowing what the actual value was. So instead of having print, I have info, and it doesn't work right now, which is not good. Oh, I had to actually copy it into... That's how hard it is to build plugins. You saw how simple that was. Very short. Copy that small snippet into a certain directory. It knows where to find it, how to load it, things like that, and then suddenly you have this documentation available. So if you find some part of Puppet and you're like, well, that should be exposed directly. I want to do stupid things with it. It's really easy to now begin doing stupid things with that. Write your own extension to that interface. And that's about how simple that stuff is. So there are a lot of these other examples of places where there's a Puppet clean script out there that can be ported to use faces. In fact, I think as part of this demo, we did that somewhere, and ends up being about 8 lines of code instead of this relatively long thing. We've got one of our PS guys has written not just a catalog diffing script that will actually compare 2 catalogs directly and tell you which resources are different and which parameters are different, but we'll do this for 30,000 hosts at a time, so you can get a quick, for all these hosts, compare development and test and tell me. So we're helping people port from 0.24 to 2.6, and they want to know, I don't want to change any behavior. I just want to have the Puppet version be different. That porting process becomes very easy when you can visually compare the difference in catalogs between the 2.4 catalogs and 2.6 catalogs. It's pretty freaking awesome. And again, I mean, you track Jeff McCune down or Dan Bodie down. They've been hacking on this stuff for the last couple of months, and it's been really, really sweet. All right, so I also figured I'd give you a quick idea of what we're actually working on. And when I say we, one of the things we're trying to do, one of the things that is fantastically challenging at a company, in some ways it's more challenging being an open source company where everyone's in the same city. If we were all in different cities, we would have to do all of our collaboration on mailing lists and things. So it's been relatively challenging to actually maintain the community-oriented outward view while also trying to figure out how to grow from 3 employees to 40 in the space of less than 2 years. So if it sometimes feels like we're turning a deaf ear to the community, it's not because we're doing it on purpose, it's just because we're incompetent. So if we do that, just ping one of us and say, hey, we think you made a mistake here. We'd like you to try to work harder to get this kind of information public faster or more often or whatever. Nigel or I or Jose are great people to talk to about that, or James, or really anybody here who's foolish enough to advertise their work at Puppet Labs, harangue them about that. We are trying to do that, we're doing that as well as we can, but we don't always know whether we're doing a good job or not. So one of our big goals is always to flatten the on-ramp. So it's funny because anyway, I'll leave that aside for later. Basically, we want to make Puppet always easier to not just to adopt, but easy to get value from as quickly as possible. And one of the big challenges right now is if you're using Puppet, if you would like to go from I don't know what Puppet is to I'm getting value from Puppet, one of the things you have to do right now is write code. You have to know what code is even. Even if you download things from the Forge, you still have to find those things and download them and look at them and be confident of what they are. I'd like to find ways for Puppet to be valuable without having to involve code at all. So things like discovery, things like analyzing your current system and converting some of that to Puppet code, beginning to look at your world in terms of Puppet without having to write any code. So we're trying to find ways to flatten that on-ramp. We're also trying to build ad hoc tooling because the reality is that you can't just do everything centralized. I would like that to be the case, but you can't just switch to, you know what, never log onto systems ever, and if everything's on fire, then just use Puppet to fix it eventually. People do ad hoc work, and even if sometimes they shouldn't, right? You've got some coworker who you've told a bunch of times, no, really, I will actually lock your account if you do that one more time. You still have to, you don't want to be in a failure state because somebody made a mistake, right? You'd like the system to work with you. So we're trying to find ways to make Puppet at least compatible with some of this ad hoc work that you either have to do or your coworker does even though you tell them not to do, or you do even though you know you shouldn't. And a big focus of ours is figuring out cross-node applications. This is relatively complicated. It's taking rather than saying, oh, I've got a database server, saying, I've got an application and it's composed of a web server and a database server and an application server. And having that whole view visible and available to you. This is really complicated because there are a couple of difficult infrastructure extensions that need to exist for this to be possible. Once those infrastructure extensions are in place, I think the actual work itself will be straightforward. It's kind of like, once you build all of the roads and all of the highways, the pavement's not that hard. Like once you've cut the hole through the mountain, putting tarmac on it's not difficult. But this is a big focus of ours. And then just taking all this data that I've been talking about all this time and putting it in databases that are actually useful and extensible and scalable. I was talking to somebody in London, and he loves store configs. He thinks it's great, and he's fully willing to sacrifice the 18 minutes it takes for his monitoring server to store its configuration in store configs. And since I first built store configs 4 years ago or 5 years ago, I've wanted it to be an absolutely critical part of Puppet. I've wanted everybody to have to use some equivalent of store configs, but it's never been fast enough. It's never been good enough to say, you have to use this to use Puppet. So one of our big goals is to figure out how we can take all that data, put it in a place, build an infrastructure that actually scales to the level of people who are running 20 machines, 500 machines, or 50,000 machines. We need something that works for all those cases, and that ends up being moderately complicated. And we're also very concerned about the change lifecycle. I've got code that, it's easy when you don't have anything anywhere, but when you've got a steady state and you want to take the existing system and make some changes to that, deploying code throughout that system is actually pretty complicated today. You have to know that dance of how do I get this from my keyboard to production without setting very many things on fire. mCollective is a great tool for this. mCollective is very helpful in doing like phased rollouts and things like that. And if you notice, all the tools that I demoed where you can have like separately triggering the downloading of catalogs and things like that, that actually helps to do phased rollouts too. So you should see some interesting work there. But just generally trying to make it easier to do these phased rollouts and managing the life cycle of changes overall is a big priority. And I would have liked to have gotten a more recent picture of my villain, but iPhoto won't work for it, so I couldn't. So this is about a year old. But anyway, any questions, if I have any time for questions?
You have time.
All right. Any questions? In the back. The question was if we're going to try to keep the Puppet internal API stable. So the goal is actually to make the Faces API itself, the Faces themselves, the internal API, eventually, so that we can actually do things like dramatically change the internal APIs and not have to worry as much about the non-face aspects of the API. It's going to be complicated for a little while. Faces is now, as a name, Randall can tell us the details, but probably 4 weeks old, 3 weeks old. I think the next release of Puppet will probably see some significant changes to how Faces themselves are structured as people struggle with it. But certainly our goal is to have a very stable API. I will say that in general, we actually do pretty well on backward compatibility. I've got people who are using 23.2 and are seeing a pretty smooth upgrade to 2.6 and 2.7. And even people who are writing scripts that worked 2 years ago, they often are not very hard to port or don't require any porting. But one of the major goals of Faces is to say, this is the part of the system that we're not going to make backward compatibility claims about, but Faces we will. And in fact, if you looked at the example code for Faces, there's versioning built into the API. And the goal there is to make it so that we can do a very good job of either maintaining compatibility or giving you good information when you're trying to use something that compatibility has changed. Any other questions? Yes. So the question was, why change to Apache if Puppet Enterprise is shipping the same code? Really, the license change has almost nothing to do with Puppet Enterprise. It's entirely about people downloading Puppet separately and doing things like integrating with it. We just had a number of customers and potential partners who had concerns about directly integrating with Puppet if it was under the GPL. And there are a lot of things that literally the people who wrote the GPL don't know whether they're legally possible or not. So does using a Ruby library from another Ruby library constitute linking? They actually don't know. And that fear, that lack of knowledge in the law is a frightening place for many people. And that hesitation is what we were trying to avoid by switching to this license. So it's not about Puppet Enterprise at all, because Puppet Enterprise, just like Red Hat's commercial license for their open source product, it's relatively straightforward. It's kind of a wrapper around a bunch of open source software. It's really all about people who are using Puppet in integrations and who are distributing Puppet on their own. Obviously, we can distribute Puppet safely. We're not afraid of that. It's everybody else, or not everybody, but certain people who are afraid of them distributing Puppet by itself. Maybe one more question? more IPv6 support in Factor. I would say that we have a lot of plans on Factor that are moving very slowly, and as far as I know, that's not high on the list of plans, but we would love to have your help adding IPv6 support to Factor. I thought I saw some movement there, but I don't remember the specifics. So I know we'd like to have that, but it's not, of the things that get complained about Factor, I would say that's not highest in the priority list. One of the highest in the priority list in Factor is getting structured data out of Factor and just generally making the internal API more maintainable going forward. So. I think it's much hotter on the stage than it is anyway. All right, I guess that's it for questions. Feel free to track me down afterwards and harangue me, and enjoy Faces.